Violette1st, Bill's destructive day. Introduction. Hello and welcome to another Violette1st story. This is all about Bill being dim-witted by going to Williams High School, MAHS. Then he steals the groundskeeper's tractor, which then he goes on a joyride around Mount Airy, Maryland. Then the Anderson family goes to a 5-star restaurant, where Bill has a massive freak-out for a ridiculous reason and his multiple other destructive moments throughout the day. Main characters: Violette, Bill and William. Violette is the mother, Bill is the father. William is Violette and Bill's misbehaving teen. One quick thing, if I refer to something called the boys, I am referring to Bill and William. I am using this as a shorter term. That is all I have to say. Enjoy the story. Plot: it is a peaceful morning in Mount Airy, Maryland. In the Anderson household, Violette is waking up. A few seconds later, Violette walks into William's bedroom. A minute later, Violette and William walk downstairs. 20 minutes later, Bill walks downstairs. A minute later, Violette and William walk outside. 30 seconds later, Violette and William speed off to MAHS. 8 minutes later, William walks into MAHS. A minute later, William walks into Mr. DJ's arithmetic class. A few seconds later, the class begins. 20 minutes later, William asks Mr. DJ if he can use the potty. A few seconds later, William runs out. Meanwhile, Bill is getting ready for the day. A few minutes later, Bill speeds off somewhere. A few minutes later, Bill parks his truck in a parking lot near MAHS. Meanwhile, William is walking back to Mr. DJ's class. A minute later, William sits in his assigned seat. A few minutes later, William looks out of a window. A second later, William sees Bill is getting onto the groundskeeper's tractor for the 4th time. William asks Mr. DJ if he can talk with the headmaster. Mr. DJ gives William the green light. A few seconds later, William sprints to the headmaster's office. 30 seconds later, William bursts into the office. 3 seconds later, William explains what he saw. A few seconds later, the headmaster looks out of a window. A few seconds later, he screams. Meanwhile, Violette is putting away some dishes. A few moments later, Violette sees she got a call from the headmaster of MAHS. A few seconds later, Violette answers it. 2 minutes later, Violette revs her SUV's engine. A few seconds later, Violette speeds off to MAHS. A minute later, Violette parks in front of MAHS. 3 seconds later, Violette walks over to a field. 3 minutes later, Violette sees Bill on the groundskeeper's tractor. A second later, Violette watches the stolen tractor drive onto the streets of Mount Airy. A minute later, Violette runs into the headmaster's office. A second later, Violette explains what she saw. A few moments later, Violette and William get into the SUV. A few seconds later, Violette speeds off to find Bill and the stolen tractor. A minute later, Violette finds a trail of mass destruction. Violette follows the trail. 12 minutes later, William sees a row of police cars moving very slowly. A few minutes later, Violette spots the stolen tractor in front of a Trader Joe's. Violette parks the SUV. A few seconds later, Violette and William arrive at the entrance of the Trader Joe's. 2 minutes later, Bill drives the tractor into the entrance. 30 seconds later, Bill drives off. 2 minutes later, Violette and William speed off to find Bill. A few minutes later, Violette finds Bill running on foot from an army of police officers. A minute later, Bill gets arrested. 10 seconds later, Violette and William drive back to MAHS. 20 minutes later, Bill and some police officers chain Bill down to a chair in the headmaster's office. A few seconds later, the governor of Maryland walks into the headmaster's office. An hour later, Bill agrees to work Saturdays and Sundays to pay off his $82 million debt that he created during his 4th tractor joyride. A few seconds later, Bill gets unchained. 10 minutes later, Violette and the boys speed off somewhere. 12 minutes later, Violette and the boys walk into Chuck E. Cheese's. A minute later, they order several pizzas. A few minutes later, Bill eats an entire pizza. 3 minutes later, Violette nags Bill for eating an entire pizza by himself. A few seconds later, Bill speeds off with $300. A minute later, Bill buys $300 worth of e-tickets. 10 minutes later, Bill runs out of tickets. A few seconds later, Bill exchanges his points for tokens. A few minutes later, a cashier tells Bill he is too old for prizes. Bill screams at the top of his lungs. A few seconds later, Bill runs away. A minute later, Violette and William see people running away. Violette and William sigh because they know what is occurring. A few seconds later, Violette sees Bill has a metal baseball bat. A few seconds later, Bill resumes smashing arcade games. 10 minutes later, Bill finishes wreaking havoc. A few seconds later, Bill walks into the kitchen. A minute later, Bill starts destroying the kitchen. 2 minutes later, the owner of the sect bans the Anderson family for life. A few seconds later, Violette and William walk outside. A minute later, Bill gets into the SUV. A minute later, Violette and the boys speed home. 10 minutes later, Violette and the boys walk into the house. 10 minutes later, Violette and the boys finish changing into their wedding clothes. A few minutes later, Violette and the boys get into the SUV. A minute later, Violette and the boys speed off to a Captain Grill. 40 minutes later, Violette and the boys walk into the Captain Grill. A few minutes later, they sit at a table. 10 minutes later, they order their beverages. A few minutes later, Violette and William order appetizers. Bill orders 8 appetizers. Violette quietly roars at Bill. Bill gets up. A few seconds later, Violette chases after Bill. A minute later, Violette drags Bill back to their table. A few seconds later, Bill chugs an entire bottle of $200 wine. Violette roars quietly at Bill. A few seconds later, their waiter arrives at the table. A minute later, Violette and William each order a hamburger. Bill orders 7 items. A few seconds later, their waiter walks away. A few seconds later, Violette nags Bill for his order and his current health situation. A few minutes later, Violette tells Bill he only has 5.5 months left until he dies. A few seconds later, Violette and William walk to the potty. A few minutes later, they walk back to the table. 10 seconds later, Violette sees a massive pile of plates. Bill explains he ate the rest of the appetizers. A minute later Violette and William sit down. 40 minutes later Violette and William tuck into their meals. A few minutes later Bill screams at the top of his lungs. Bill gets up. 3 seconds later Bill pushes everything on their table to the floor. Half a second later Violette tells Bill he needs to behave since they just got unbanned. Bill sprints away. A few seconds later the patrons in the restaurant run away. A minute later Violette hears smashing sounds. A few seconds later William runs away. A few seconds later Violette and the staff run outside. A few minutes later the building starts to shake violently. 10 seconds later Bill runs outside. A few seconds later the patrons and low-ranking staff speed away in their cars. A few seconds later the building collapses. Violette walks to her SUV. A minute later Violette drags her chained chest to the crowd. Bill screams at the top of his lungs. A minute later Violette and several people throw Bill onto the roof of the SUV. A few seconds later Violette starts chaining down Bill to the roof. 30 minutes later Violette and William get into the SUV. A minute later they speed home. 70 minutes later Violette and William start to unchain Bill. 15 minutes later Violette and the boys walk into the house. A few seconds later Violette's E-system goes off. A few seconds later Violette digs into Bill's pockets. A few seconds later Violette roars at Bill for stealing a candy bar from Captain Grill. A minute later gets a call from the owner of Captain Grill. A few seconds later Violette answers. A few minutes later Violette roars very loudly. 3 seconds later Violette throws her purse into the kitchen. Violette hangs up the call as she enters the kitchen. A few seconds later Violette starts picking up her purse mess. 10 minutes later Violette hears very offensive music. A few seconds later Violette hears a vehicle pull up in front of the house. Violette walks outside. 10 seconds later Violette roars at Bill for playing offensive music. A few seconds later Bill tells Violette he was just bringing his truck home after the tractor escapade. Violette roars at Bill. A few seconds later Violette walks into the house. A second later Violette hears her E-system go off. Bill then takes out a can of raviolis out of his pocket. A few seconds later Violette turns the E-system off. A minute later Violette throws out Bill's can of raviolis. 3 seconds later Violette walks to the potty. A few seconds later Bill walks outside with Violette's brand new Chromebook. 2 minutes later Violette walks out of the potty. A second later Violette smells smoke. 10 seconds later Violette roars at Bill for torching her $2,000 Chromebook. Violette then gets into a deadly fist fight with Bill. 3 minutes later William strolls outside. 10 seconds later the Chromebook explodes. 1 minute later Will pours a bucket out cool water onto the Chromebook fire. A few seconds later Violette and Bill stop fighting. 10 seconds later Violette and William walk into the house. A second later Bill walks inside. A second later Violette screams at Bill. Bill then walks into the kitchen. 10 minutes later Violette smells smoke. A few seconds later Violette roars at Bill. A second later Violette walks away. 2 minutes later Violette walks into the kitchen with a BB gun. A few seconds later Bill grabs the BB gun. 10 seconds later Bill shoots Violette's rear end. Violette screams with pure anger. 3 seconds later William speeds upstairs. A few seconds later Violette screams her head off at Bill. Bill then walks away. A minute later Violette screams as Bill speeds off in his truck. 20 minutes later Bill walks into the house with a bag. 2 seconds later Violette hears her E-system. A minute later Violette roars at Bill as he eats a triple whopper from Burger King. A few seconds later Violette slaps Bill's rear end. 3 seconds later Bill finishes eating his sandwich. A few seconds later Violette watches Bill sit on his rear end on his chair. 20 seconds later William walks into the kitchen. 20 minutes later Violette and William tuck into some grilled and seasoned pork chops. A few seconds later Bill grabs lighter fluid and a blowtorch. A minute later Bill grabs the plate that contains the pork chops that William made. A few seconds later Bill walks outside. 3 seconds later Violette and William look for the plate. Violette screams when she sees the plate is missing. A few seconds later Violette and William walk outside. 10 seconds later William starts bawling his eyes out a little as Bill torches the pork chops. A few seconds later Violette roars at Bill. A minute later Violette douses the fire. A few seconds later Violette and the boys walk inside. 2 minutes later Violette forces Bill to wash the dirty dishes. Bill screams at the top of his lungs. A few seconds later Violette tells Bill to do it correctly. Bill screams at Violette. Violette sighs as Bill rips the dishwasher door open. 10 seconds later Bill pulls the rack out. A few seconds later Bill places a dish gently into the sink. A few seconds later Violette walks away. 3 seconds later Bill starts throwing dishes all over the kitchen. A minute later Violette returns to the kitchen. 2 seconds later Violette screams with pure anger when she sees dish fragments everywhere. A few seconds later Violette hears a massive crash. 10 seconds later Violette walks to the backyard. 3 seconds later Violette sees Bill is preparing to burn the dishwasher. A few seconds later Violette screams. 3 seconds later a massive fire engulfs the dishwasher. 3 seconds later Violette grabs the garden hose. A minute later the fire is doused. A few seconds later Violette turns the hose off. A minute later Violette walks into the house. A few seconds later Bill walks into the house. A few seconds later Bill walks upstairs. A minute later Violette starts picking up all of the dish fragments. A minute later William helps Violette. 10 minutes later Violette and William speed off to Tree City Sales. An hour later Violette and William finish setting up their new dishwasher. A minute later William starts washing some new china dishes. A few minutes later Violette starts a cycle on the brand new dishwasher. A few minutes later Violette and William walk upstairs. A few seconds later Bill wakes up. A few seconds later Violette screams at Bill. A minute later the Anderson family falls asleep. Conclusion. Hello there. I hope you enjoyed yet another Violette1st story. More stories to come. Bye for now.